over the weekend, protests broke out in China over the government's zero COVID policy. The widespread demonstrations were triggered by a deadly fire last Thursday that killed 10 people and left 9 injured. It appears lockdown measures delayed firefighters from reaching the victims in time. Assistant to the Secretary of Defense John Kirby was asked about the protests. Let's take a listen to that.
I was hoping, what is the White House's message, the president's message to people in China who are peacefully protesting COVID lockdowns there? And then did the topic of China's zero COVID policy come up in the president's bilateral meeting with President Xi when they met in Indonesia a couple weeks ago?
They did talk about COVID and the effect that the pandemic had around the world. Clearly that came up inside the conversation. I don't know if specifically the zero COVID policy was an issue of discussion, but certainly COVID was on the agenda, as you might expect that it would be. And our message to peaceful protesters around the world is the same and consistent. People should be allowed the right to assemble and to peacefully protest policies or laws or dictates that they take issue with.
Does the White House support their effort to sort of regain personal freedoms in light of these lockdowns?
The White House supports the right of peaceful protest.
House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy tweeted against the Biden administration's response to China's lockdowns and promised that come January, the GOP Select Committee on China will, quote, reckon with the pariah that is the Chinese Communist Party. Joining us now to discuss is geopolitical risk analyst at Morning Consult, Scott Moskowitz. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, Scott, there have been some mixed characterizations of what these protests are. Some, and I think there's probably some legitimate diversity among why people are protesting. So some people wanted to end to zero COVID, but there is also an argument that they are asking for certain provisions that were supposed to make the lockdowns easier, not an end to the lockdowns themselves, and into some of the more maybe draconian aspects of them. It seems like locking certain entrances and exits may have contributed to this, the deaths from this fire, which is obviously so tragic and regrettable. What's your take on what's actually going on the ground in China?
I think with any sort of, largely uncoordinated protest movement, which this seems to be, they're born out of frustration. So it's not like a lot of people organized together and we said, we have these specific policy aims. There was frustration about the state of things in general, all related to COVID policies and other things that have tied into it, possibly what's going on with the economy. And from there, it just spiraled. And so some people might have had very simple aims. You saw everything ranging from people calling for, I just want to be able to go out and watch a movie, to people saying, down with Xi Jinping, down with the Communist Party, which was a very small, part of the protest probably at this point. But you can see how quickly these things sort of spiral.
Yeah, it's so, unusual to see protests even of this size in China, given, how repressive the government is and so on. So what would you, expect to see after this? Is this going to be a situation where they protest and then, it's kind of going back to the status quo? Or is there a sense that things have really been shaken up and there could be political ramifications or ramifications for the protesters?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and you're right. These are really unprecedented protests. And I want to clarify and say it's not that there aren't protests in China, which is something that people often think does not happen. But what there are often isolated protests about specific things, often related to property seizures or labor. And the government does a pretty good job of isolating them. Nobody hears about them. Here, what was so wild was that you had protests in multiple cities going on at once, roughly about the same thing. And the protesters seemed to be aware of each other and drawing inspiration from each other. And that was a real breakdown in the party state's censorship mechanisms. So it could have pretty far-reaching ramifications.
Scott, we've been giving a lot of credit to the fact that there are a number of voices on the right that have been critical about kind of the blank check of military funding for Ukraine and who have been pushing more, frankly, than the left flank of this country towards some kind of diplomatic resolution. But it does seem like based on Kevin McCarthy's statement, that while there is a kind of disinterest in doing World War III in Ukraine and Russia, there does seem to be some appetite for a direct engagement with China with the possibly cataclysmic implications that will come along with it. What do you make of the posture of Kevin McCarthy, who stands to be House Minority Leader in all likelihood, saying that it's time for a reckoning with the Chinese Communist Party?
Yeah, I think you're right. We see that in our data when we track how people across different parties feel about different countries. Obviously, after the war in Ukraine, Russia sort of fell down and enmity towards Russia really rose. And for a while, it was separate from China. But since then, we've seen, aggression, enmity towards China, mistrust of China rising, especially in the Republican Party. Both Democrats and Republicans are pretty negative on China, but Republicans are especially negative on China. And, I don't know who it necessarily serves. I mean, nobody wants a war. War with China would be especially cataclysmic. Any kind of breakdown with China. We're already in pretty bad circumstances. Things may have improved a little bit with Biden and Xi meeting, but it's not great. Not great for us, for them, for the global economy.
We've spent a lot of time, not just us, everyone, trying to psychoanalyze Vladimir Putin. What is he thinking with this invasion? What, is he a crazy? Is he a madman? Did he miscalculate, et cetera? What would we be saying about Xi Jinping's thinking if we were trying to get inside his head? Is he watching these protests and saying, wow, my policies have really gone overboard with zero COVID. We bet it all on this and it's not working out? Or is he saying, oh, well, we'll just crack down harder. We're going to stay the course. What else can we do? Is he, obviously, he's a rational actor to some degree in that he's done a remarkable job of staying in power and consolidating power, actually. What do we make of how what we know about how he thinks through these things?
Yeah, I think you're right. He's a rational actor. It's hard to say with Putin. The one similarity they have is that increasingly they are surrounded by loyalists and yes men, and that can push them into weird positions where they're caught off guard by reactions to things. That being said, as I said, there aren't many dissenting voices within the party, so he still remains in a pretty strong position politically, and he might be thinking about making some changes, but policy-wise, but I don't think he's a person who will accept being pushed, and he could come down pretty hard.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that China's reported fewer than 6,000, I think a little over 5,000 COVID deaths. America, of course, has reported well over 1 million COVID deaths, and that doesn't necessarily mean that people would welcome some of the more restricted policies. Some people are obviously happy to make that trade-off and have thoughts and feelings about whether or not the death counts are being recorded accurately. But some have pointed out that in the context of the Chinese protests, folks who were very critical of protests against restrictive COVID policies, who were politically on the right, like the Canadian trucker convoy, folks who are very critical of those efforts seem to have a lot of support for the Chinese protesters. Naomi Klein, who is a progressive leftist writer who frankly wrote a book about this in the shock doctrine, talking about how moments of kind of national tragedy or pandemics and things like that can be exploited by politicians for political ends, oftentimes moving them to the right, has seemingly not imagined that this could be a situation, the type of which she often wrote about. What do you make of some of the inconsistencies of folks who seem to see the Chinese protesters protesting COVID lockdowns as an example of freedom and liberty, and saw the kind of conservative protesters against the lockdowns on this side of the Pacific quite differently?
Yeah, I mean, I understand the argument, and I can understand the frustration that people on the right might have, seeing that there's some, maybe a little hypocritical there. But I think you've got to understand that these lockdowns in China are very different than anything that we experienced in the U.S. It never would have occurred in the U.S. I mean, people are being locked in their apartments for weeks at a time. People's pets are being taken away. Old people are getting bullied back beyond cordons. When we talked about lockdowns in the U.S., we really meant something fundamentally different. Yes, businesses were closed. It did impact people's livelihood, and it was tragic in a lot of ways, and a lot of people suffered, and we had to make very hard decisions. But it is nothing like the kind of often capricious exercise of authority that you've seen in the case of the Chinese lockdowns.
Well, we appreciate you joining us today, Scott.
Thanks for having me. It was great to be here.
And we'll have more Rising for you right after this.